welcome everyone who's joined us this evening. This event is sponsored by the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies here at ACC. And leading our conversation this evening, we have the wonderful Dr. Mark Cunningham. And joining him, we have Dr. Samuel Echevarria Cruz. And I'm going to turn it over to both of them to introduce themselves, starting with Mark, and then we will get this conversation underway. So thank you, everyone.
Hey, thanks, Layla. I'm Dr. Mark Cunningham. I am professor of radio, television, and film here at ACC. Just a little something about me. I teach courses in media literacy. I teach intro to cinema. And I teach our media survey course, which is called Introduction to Radio, Television, and Film. Pretty published number of essays in cinema journals and also in books. I'm currently finishing up my own book that's being published by Columbia University Press's film imprint Wallflower on race, gender, and narrative in John Singleton's films Boys in the Hood, Poetic Justice, and Baby Boy. So that's it. Dr. Echevarria Cruz, I'd like to introduce you, sir.
Thank you. Awesome. And thank you for that exciting news. Look forward to hearing when the book is out. And I know we're going to have some events on that, I bet. It's going to be outstanding. And it's outstanding to be here. Well, it's great to see everyone. My name is Samuel Echevarria Cruz. I'm a professor of sociology here at ACC. I also have a new role as Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives in Instruction. And in that role, it's my job to connect academic instruction initiatives with the best DEI resources we have at the college and outside of the college. And so I'm very excited about that role. And yeah, I'm passionate about sociology, and I really try to focus a lot of the work I do around history of race and the sociology of race, ethnicity in this country.
Nice. Cool. Right. Well, glad you're here to join me in this conversation about what I thought was a very, not only interesting, but jarring documentary in a lot of ways called Bisbee 17, which I must say, Layla introduced to me. I had not seen it, and Layla was talking about it, had mentioned it prior in the film series we did the previous school term. And then it came up, she brought it up again, and I watched it and was just really struck by it. The way this film utilizes not only kind of standard traditional documentary style with interviews and such, but also to use reenactment to chronicle a very, not only very important, but little known, I think, I would argue or say, little known, kind of moment in our history. So in that regard, in it combining documentary and these kind of, like I said, again, reenacted elements, this movie really kind of chronicles, or this documentary rather still kind of chronicles the residents of a town called Bisbee, Arizona, which is a former mining town near the Mexico border. And so this town is now commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Bisbee Deportation, where many of the people in this town who have been deputized by the sheriff department, whatever else, really deported a number of town citizens, people in the unions, as a matter of fact, who were working as miners that were, and many of whom were Mexican-American, that were basically taken out and dropped off in the middle of nowhere to die. And so it's just really interesting and was an education for me to watch this film and learn about, yet another event in history that has, it's not being taught in our classrooms. It's not really being discussed the way that it should be. And so I'm glad that we're able to bring attention to that here today. So, I'd like to start off, Sam, if I could, asking you, why do you feel, particularly, this is a town in the film that's largely comprised of, the town citizens are white. And so there are these instances in the film where they really spend a bit of time, either, some don't, but not all of them, but some people in the film spend this time justifying, or in the town, justifying or explaining away kind of the wrongdoings of the past as we see happen in the film, right? So do you think the people of Bisbee have really accepted their city's history when you watch this film?
Thank you. That's a great question. You know, I think you hit the nail on the head by focusing on the theme of history. And one of the first things that struck me about this, one of the themes that ran through a thread was how the residents know that they've not talked about this. They weren't supposed to talk about this. And that just reminds me kind of how history is a narrative that we make choices about what we present to the public, what we keep in our families, what we decide is the right history to talk about and the wrong history to talk about. And so, yeah, I was struck by, I think there was a comment, one of the characters said, you know, the only people who are here, the descendants of those who are here, are those that obviously were for or neutral, and were definitely not against this action, this illegal action. And so you're going to have a very strong narrative built up in this community. So it's no surprise that, when you see the film as an outsider, you're shocked at how hard it is to see a very simple story, a story of abuse and oppression, and in some cases murder, right? There's other things that have happened before Bisbee. There's the Jerome deportations as kind of a setup. They had already started this idea. And there were murders and that had happened. And so, yeah, it was a stark reminder that we frame history, and we know that history in many guises, from schools to the movies we watch, history is framed by those who have the power to control the narrative. And this little town, certain residents that still exist have had a very strong will to keep history one-sided, so to speak.
Yeah, that really kind of speaks to another question I was going to ask you about the phrase "history is written by the winners." I mean, this is something we talked about in our last discussion, where we discussed Raoul Peck's documentary. We discussed Raoul Peck's documentary, "Exterminate All the Brutes." That's it's currently on HBO. We talked about the first two parts of that, and that was a question that came up. This notion again, this idea of history being written by the winners, and yet that really came to mind, and really, kind of came to the forefront of my mind watching this particular documentary. That this, like you said, that this is a story that is absolutely being constructed by the people who have the power to tell the narrative, even in the present day. Even though they are it's interesting in the way that they're pointing fingers at themselves, right? That this has happened, but in a way, still trying to control that narrative in some way. Did you feel that still too? That even though they were being critical, or certainly bringing attention to it, that they still were trying to make it look good, so to speak?
Yeah. How many times does a character say, "I understood both sides"?
Yeah.
Never mind those characters who say, "We had to do this," right? Especially the older gentleman who had spent 58 years from the lowliest task to the head of the company, mining company. We had to do this for freedom, etc. But so many people kept repeating, I can understand both sides. And to me, that's where it was kind of easy to see that there really wasn't an opening for them to understand a very different narrative. And that was brought home. And I'm still not sure about this scene. And then, when we have a discussion with everyone here in a bit, I'll be curious. That scene where the dashing actor who's playing the sheriff, not the sheriff, he's playing one of the heads, and meets the young Latinx man, young man, and they're saying, living the American life, and he says, actually, it's white people who came here. You came here, so your phrase is invalid. This isn't about acculturation to whites. If anything, whites should have acculturated to the Mexican culture of this land. And I was curious. I was like, and he's like, "Thank you. It was great talking to you." And I was like, "Was that a staged? Is that This is very confusing, but it was very truthful." And that is, two narrative histories clashed so easily. I mean, and so powerfully. And how many of us have had to say things like that? So difficult to say. Your narrative is so off base relative to the kind of the, you know, the history of this land and the people that were in it. I'm gonna have a hard time communicating with you maybe about this. So
yeah, and I think you bring up a point, Sam, that's really striking about this film, right? Is that there are so many instances in it, right, because of the reenactment, that you're not sure if you're hearing, you know, something that's scripted or something that's about that's a part of the reenactment, or you're hearing people's actual thoughts. And because they're so similar in nature, right, that we have all of this time, this 100-year gap of time that's happened, yet the language, right, is so, unfortunately, you know, contemporary. You know, and it's one that it threw me off quite a bit sometimes, watching it, going like, wait a minute, are they acting this, or is this what they really think? And I think that's some of what is so effective about this documentary, right? Is that you really do, as an audience member, have to spend the time, right, thinking about how much of this that's being said, how far is that from the things that are said during the reenactment? How far is that from people's actual thoughts about what's happening? Yeah.
And you know, you say that to me is it. You don't watch films like this. You don't watch documentaries like this very often. And I was able to read an article by one of the consultants. She was a history professor who was from Bisbee, and didn't know anything about it growing up. And she's of Latinx descent, and so she consulted. I think she was her name was Ortiz. I'm trying to remember, but they were talking about this plan to commemorate with Mr. Greene, the director, and the discussion that she outlined was like, is this reenactment healthy for us? Is this something that's going to work? Is this something that's going to be too difficult to deal with? Or is it going to be, like you say, is it going to be silly? There was worries about the frivolity of it, insincerity. But I think it works because the streams of documentary, you know, wall breaking, and then real activism, you know, the artists, the music, people expressing kind of artistic responses to history. It works. It works, and it makes you think. I think you're right. It makes you think more than you would otherwise.
Yeah,
it makes you much more of an active audience member to try to decipher and decode, and in that sense, it makes it even more emotionally connecting.
Yeah. Do you think though? So, you know, again, this is very, like you said and mentioned, that this is, you know, in terms of construction, cinematic construction, and particularly where documentary film is concerned, you know, we don't see a lot like this. I mean, you know, more and more we're starting to see instances where documentary is pushing the boundaries of how it's being portrayed. I think like Joshua Oppenheimer is doing a lot of things like that with you know, documentaries like The Act of Killing. We see, you know, like this film, certainly the documentary that was done on the tower shooting, the Call Tower. They're kind of pushing these boundaries of how documentary film is being presented to us, than not just talking heads and interviews and such. But when you're dealing with a subject matter like this, which is a little known history, a very important history as well, does the reenactment, in your opinion, is it the most effective storytelling device here? You know, and particularly in the way it's in the way that we need to kind of consider this particular history. Did you find that it actually may have taken away from what we needed to know about this, or do you think it added to the resonance of this material?
I'm gonna say, much like there's a documentary I watched about Porvenir, Texas, 1918, little town just south of El Paso, where 15 Mexican men and boys were murdered by whites due to suspicion of theft, et cetera, which was unfortunately par for the course in Texas and other places. There were reenactments. Now, there were more dramatic reenactments. They were like you were transported back to Porvenir 1918, and so it was a set piece and a period sort of reenactment. I think this one is even better because that was good. It was good and it reminds us of the way we tend to watch movies, with that lens of, it's a romantic lens in a sense, because it's the past. This, I think, was better because, to be blunt, right? It's a little known history about a little known event that no one probably cares about much anyway. Not only the people of Bisbee, but just given the climate of our country and the history that we've pushed through in the 20th century and yet still struggle with. I was talking to a friend about that, and like, they were deported to Mexico, and I said, no, they were deported to New Mexico. And they're like, oh, well, that's not that big a deal, right? Can they just walk back? I said, when they went to Hermana, wasn't that far, but the issue was, the fear and the trauma. I mean, this is really the trauma that they caused this community of those. I think it was better to see it woven in, the present and the past woven in right in front of your eyes. Because the present is the past and the past is the present. And I think that's a very good device to say, and you put it right, you don't know where the present and the past sometimes begin and end. Well, that's because the same themes are still with us today. Right. And it's good to see somebody dress, in 2017, and then dress in 1917, right there in front of your eyes, so that you can see their words, their thoughts, even the clothes they wear. There's a very strong continuity between the narratives and the frames that people use to understand the world, racially and ethnically, especially, from then to today.
We have some dissenting opinions about the use of the reenactment here, and I do think, I think what's interesting about film is that, and this is something I teach in my classes, right, that we as a culture are used to a more classical narrative structuring. And so we kind of expect it to follow it in these kind of linear fashions, right? That we expect there's a level of clarity that we expect. And then when certain films don't give it to us, right, it does cause us a need to kind of have to adjust the way we watch film. And this is a movie I think that's asking us to do that, right? Is to adjust that way that we watch. And I do admit, like many are mentioning here, that the narrative, the actual reenactment versus the people talking about what they're reenacting can get muddled a little bit. However, I would argue, just in terms of what we've been talking about, Sam, I think you're so right about, is that's the thing that after the movie was over made me say, oh, okay, I'm not seeing where it stops and where it begins. And I think, and it really kind of spoke to this way to me, right, that a lot of these citizens in this town had not moved on very much from this kind of I would argue, more archaic way of thinking about what happened in that space. And the connection between reenactment, what is supposed to be fictive or fiction, and reality was absolutely blurred. And maybe that was the intent, and there was a review of the film that I read that that it was a positive review of the film, but said there's so much going on in it that even at almost a 2-hour length, it doesn't seem to be long enough to get it all in, for sure. But I mean, it's an ambitious technique to use, and I think it does call on us to really consider why those lines are blurred from a narrative standpoint. Yeah.
And I'm curious, did you get, because one of the things that stuck with me was, these are people, if there's one thing that came through, these people love their town. They love their community. And that was such a strong part. Do you think did you get a sense that there's a strong emotional impact as a viewer because of the strong emotional connection these own people have to having to relive something that I think it's fair to say many took to be a difficult experience, some more than others. But I mean, Do you think that that was actually by design?
You know, I think it's something that the filmmaker probably didn't know he was going to capture, to be honest. And I think that as these things play out, and of course, right, we all know, right, the documentary is manipulated. Right, there are certain things I'm sure that he's not showing us that he could have shown us and whatever else. But at the same time, like you said, these people know this town better than anybody. They know that history better than anybody. Some of those people have lived there lived in this town their entire lives, have been raised in this town, whatever, and they know this history. And it's this case of, right, that on this 100th anniversary, this documentary is catching them, right, in this moment where, you know, do we continue to deny this, right, or do we, because of our love of this city and this love of this place that we live, do we continue to embrace? You know, not so much embrace these things that we're turning a blind eye to, or do we meet this history head on? And I think some people did end up being, there's one of the citizens in the town who is adamant, I have a question to ask you about that later, but who's adamant about the fact that this was a travesty that happened in this town. You know, he's adamant about that and you know, vehemently says so. And then there are other people, like you said, they're like, I see both sides of it. And when you look at the story, you're like, how can you see the other side? How can you see it, right? But in the midst of that town, right, they're not objective. Many of them aren't. They're not objective at all. And I think that's what's so, you know, what also becomes interesting about it is that, you know, in terms of philosophy, if you will, about that town is not aligned, right? They're fractured in that way. And I think the documentary speaks to that fracturing, for sure.
Yeah. And I wonder if, you know, the issue of sympathizing with as many of the people as possible. You bring up a good point, you know, that so few of them, some did, but so few of them struggled with getting to that point of being critical, being very critical. And then I remember the older gentleman, the one that was presented as the most conservative view of historical, one of the most powerful scenes when he said, we had to do this. There would have been blood in the streets because my daddy told me so.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're not just dealing with the love of a town, but you're dealing with the love of family. I mean, this man was taught by his father, who was there, to say, son, we had to do this. And now you're getting, you know, now I have a hard time not looking at that man and going, I understand why you are where you are, sir. Mm-hmm. You know, it's hard to say. My own father, who I loved and respected and held up, he was on the wrong side, you know. And notice how many scenes were about intergenerational connection between 1917 and today. And that kept popping up for me to say, I can sympathize. Family and family connections are very strong. Family narratives are very strong. And we all have family stories that as we get older, we're like, was that really what happened? And no one will tell us the truth, you know? It's so, and then, you know, we deal with it as we can. So that was a great point.
And particularly the way in which the film kind of, when you talk about family, that centerpiece of that story about the two brothers, the one that ended up having to arrest the other, to deport that brother, you know, because he was going against, you know, what the consensus, so to speak, of that town wanted to have happen. And that becomes, you know, so many of those stories, right, are kind of blended into this kind of overall horrible kind of situation that happens in the name of deportation and immigration. But before we get there, I want to speak to you, ask you about the young man in the story, Fernando, and you mentioned him earlier, who I found to be really, really interesting. There's a review that likens his face to a Diego Rivera painting, which I think is so true, the kind of somberness, if you will, of his face. What did you find the most telling about Fernando, the young Mexican-American man, in the way that he comes into his own understanding about his culture and his history of Bisbee? And the reason I'm asking that is because he and the other woman, the Latina woman who ends up going into office as a Republican, which I thought was interesting as well too. But in these spaces where, in a lot of ways, particularly this young man had found himself or thought himself to be assimilated into this town because of the experiences that he had, these these really positive experiences with the people of this town, really saw himself as a part of the fabric of this community. And yet when he's initially faced with this history, he's like, basically, it's history, oh well, until he puts those clothes on. And until he speaks those words, and until he's confronted with those, and you see what resonated most to me about this movie is the actual change I saw happen in this young man as he went through this process. How do you read Fernando in this film?
Yeah, that's powerful. Especially as someone who's walked some similar paths. Growing up in Texas, and I think we're going to have many of the similar sorts of contexts, right? Growing up a Mexican American on the border in Texas, the history we're taught is also a very one-sided history, even about our own role, which ends up being a non-role, right? We're taught very little about nothing about the negative and very little about the positive, and so we just exist in a space, and we're kind of taken for granted. And that resonated with me. Fernando, I started to understand his life and even kind of the history of the Southwest, all working through him in this town as he learned more, not just about the deportation, but as he started to see how race and ethnicity play out day in, day out. And it's one of those where you start to reflect more deeply on your own history. My grandmother would sing us songs about los rinches. Rinches, right, are Texas Rangers. And they're songs to make us scared. They're not songs to make us feel protected. Because the history of the Rangers in the South, especially in South Texas, is one of murder. Right. I never thought about that because the Rangers don't do that anymore. And so the Rangers are, one of the most highly esteemed law enforcement organizations in the whole country. And yet, as I got older, I started to understand that those same phenomenon and themes and real systemic discriminatory practices are still with us today. And they affect me like they affect my brother and my sister and my parents and so forth. And, it's at that age of reckoning, especially the age of Fernando is, that your eyes start to open. This, to me, I would imagine this experience was probably like an exponential explosion of that, growth that tends to happen over a longer period of time, into your 20s and so forth, as if you uncover some histories, if you're able to step out. And so to me, yeah, he is a central character because the movie is still pretty silent about Mexican American experience. He's a minority character in a minority in a majority play. A third of those minors were Spanish surname minors, at least a third. And so, this was a huge part of that community as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I remember kind of being, when I was watching it initially, the first time I watched it, and, feeling a little, I don't want to use the word anger because it's not anger, but I would guess disappointment. I felt a little disappointed at first in the way he was kind of, and this coming from a man of color, right? As a person of color, when you see other people of color, in situations like, oh no, this is not what happened, you go like, oh man, it's right there in front of you. Like, how are you not seeing it? But then giving him the space, right, to come to that realization on his own, right? That space to learn that his experience, right, is very much so tied into the purpose of, of what was behind that deportation. As has been mentioned here already about his mother. I mean, he was able to start to make those connections. And I think before he became part of that reenactment, I don't think he was making those connections, right? And then as he becomes more engaged with what happened during the deportation, I think he started to make those links for sure. And yeah, like I said, my disappointment in him, like I said, that's my own personal, it was just initial feeling, when you watch it. I mean, of course, right. I know that, he's a kid and he has to learn, but it's just that when you see that happen, you're like, oh my God, the way sometimes, like you mentioned, that many of us of color get blindsided in this culture where we don't get taught, like you say, the way things actually happen. And the way you sometimes go around, you kind of pass that wrong headed narrative on or whatever, or you take that thinking with you in other places until you realize that, or you come into that moment of yourself where you realize that that's actually not the way it went down, and that's not the way it happened. And you do start to kind of question, like, okay, well then what actually is, my position here? Like, how do I actually fit in here? Yeah, they like me as a person, me by myself, but how does that translate to a collective?
Right.
And yeah. I don't know. I think, if that's something you don't have to worry about, then you may not see it that way. But
well, I think you speak to a little bit of both the similarities that communities of color have walked through historically in this country, but then there are differences too. And the Southwest in the treatment of Mexican Americans since 1848, for example, since the end of the Mexican-American War, there's been diversity of that treatment even amongst the kind of negative process. Texas is not New Mexico, is not California. And so for me, especially as a Texan, there are differences in some ways. For example, Arizona doesn't have a South Texas part where the 90% of everyone in South Texas is Mexican descent. Mm-hmm. And yet that's one of the poorest places in the country. And it's not until you leave there and you start to see that, wait, what historical processes led for this entire Mexican American community to be one of almost complete poverty. There's not, and I didn't hear that Mexicans were lazy till I left Brownsville and came to Austin. And I remember saying, yeah, I know some lazy Mexicans. And like, I didn't understand that what they were saying is all of us are lazy, because I know some hardworking Mexicans and some lazy Mexicans. I know some smart ones and ones who don't have any common sense. I know some rich ones and some poor ones, like, because we're all humans, right? And we all have that diversity. But it was the first time when I came out of South Texas and started to understand that, no, there are views about us, and those views have played historically into why there seems to be no access for whole communities of color out of poverty and out of sort of socioeconomic kind of lowest levels of socioeconomic status. So it's hard, especially Bisbee is a white town. I think it was mentioned more than once. Yeah, it is a white town, and that's the history of the Southwest. People think that way, even though this was Mexico, and a third of Mexico was lost during the Mexican-American War. So this was solidly Mexican land, and but no one thinks that way anymore. No one has that narrative. We're the foreigners, right? And so I think he's getting into those spaces now.
You touched on this a little bit, but I'd like for you to kind of expound on it if you could. Particularly this notion in thinking about immigration, and particularly the immigration of Mexican people. How do you think the continued struggles that are associated with immigration are addressed in the documentary? Do you think it's glossed over? I think you touched on a little bit like that it is a little bit glossed over, but if you could expound on that.
Yeah, it is, right? Bisbee is like a stone's throw from the border, from the U.S.-Mexico border, and you don't get any sense of the cultural richness of being so close to the geopolitical Mexico. And so, yeah, from that point, that Arizona context tells me a lot about the history of Arizona. This is an area that was part of the Gadsden Purchase, and so it had attention given to it. But immigration is the 20th century really is and that's why I think this document is great. The 20th century Mexican American experience is probably an immigration and labor story, right? It's an immigration and labor story framed in a systemic racism kind of an experience. And that is beginning with World War I, the United States pulling Mexicans from Mexico for labor needs and then sending them back when they don't need them and bringing them back when they do, and so forth. And then, and with that, that labor story, you've got that labor and immigration nexus. You've got such a complex, conflicted community. Sociologists have long known Mexicans who are in Mexico support an open border until they cross, and then they're very likely to support a closed border, and that's a very real phenomenon. And so the history of the 20th century in Mexican American communities in the Southwest especially is one of this debate between, and very similar to how W.E.B. Du Bois wanted to approach the issue of Black integration, right? Persuasion, just upward suasion. If we just act white, we'll be accepted. The problem with being Mexican American Southwest, we can't act white when we keep having Mexicans crossing the border, and we're all Mexican to the whites. That is the story of Bisbee, and that's the story of the Southwest. And that is, as soon as Anglos flooded Texas and then the Southwest, they didn't care after 1848 who was a citizen and who wasn't. And so because of the continued immigration, Mexican Americans have always had this conflicted sort of impulse to support Mexican kind of community and big C community, and to deflect and to critique immigration and how immigration and labor are so intertwined in the Southwest. And so this movie picks up only on one of those, really, and you don't hear anything about, I was so curious to get more data, and the documentarian doesn't really give us data on who the miners were. You hear some of them were Slavic, and I think David brought that up. Someone with Eastern European. I read a report that said only a third of the miners were actually U.S. citizens, which is fascinating, because that means that there was a healthy mix of Mexican and European undocumented workers, right, who were there necessary for the operations of the mine until they started to express their voice as laborers. And we have the early 20th century kind of union struggle being played out. But yeah, it's a tough story. It's a tough story to tell, and I think they missed some opportunities to how many brown people do we hear from in this documentary? So few. And when you hear from them, their voices are loud, like they have a history to tell. And especially that older gentleman, I was so surprised when he talks to Fernando in Spanish.
Oh yeah.
And that was, especially as a Spanish speaker, that was powerful. I mean, he was doing the union organizing in Spanish, and it just reminded you that right, the undercurrent of this entire area is that Mexican culture and the Mexican language and the Mexican space. And it's kind of not there. It's kind of erased, or this attempt to erase it. So it's tough.
So Alonda, I have another question to ask you in relationship to that, just to piggyback off of that. It's like you said, they dropped the ball a little bit there. But how does the film, from your perspective, speak to the importance of unionizing and laboring and the volatile history that's associated with those practices?
Yeah, I think it does. I think that's not the point of the documentary. The more I think about it, and the more I try to review it, only a third of the miners were actually IWW. A third of the deported people were actually card-carrying IWW members. So they deported 2/3 of the people who were not at all, at least officially affiliated with that union. And so it speaks to the context of what the entire United States was struggling with, and that is, and here we have kind of probably some racial overtones too, but the issue of and I think you did get a little bit of that. That is, what did the strikers want? There was no talk of even many of the family members understood that there was no talk of saboteur. There was just talk of health and safety and living wages. So this is an episode where, this is that phenomenon that the United States have. To be a good to be a patriot, you can't be anything but a capitalist, and you can't be anything but a certain kind of capitalist, a laissez-faire capitalist, which is really code for profit motive capitalist, short term, because we know that long term capitalism, if you believe in laissez-faire, long term labor needs to speak and have a healthy voice for capitalism to flourish. If not, it eats itself. And so that's what's happening here. Just the labor demands of those who are at the bottom of the scale in terms of risk and danger and so forth. And I think there's a missed opportunity there to really tease out. This happened in New Mexico in August. They did the exact same thing in New Mexico, even though it wasn't people actually on strike. It was fear of a strike. They moved, I think it was about 200 people to Colorado. The difference here was none of them were in the union, none of them. And there was outrage. And the governor of New Mexico got involved and said, you can't do that. Like, we got to stop doing that. And so there's this incredible history. For those of you, somebody asked, what happened to the miners? There's a great article, an academic journal article about what happened to them. They were put in an army base, an army camp in Columbus, New Mexico. And most of them from there just left and spread out through the Southwest looking for work. And they were there for till September, when finally President Wilson decided to shut it down, because the locals were getting nervous about having these possible wobblies in their midst. So most of them did, because there was work everywhere to be had. I think that was also another story that wasn't really told. That the demand for labor was through the roof. So this was not about labor. This was about labor, but this was about, a bigger struggle.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of the stuff that they touch on. I think there's a movie we screened last series, Herbert Biberman's movie, Salt of the Earth, that talks about the zinc miners and striking and unionizing and things of that nature, and with Mexican immigrants and such. It's really kind of connection to that. It reminded me a lot of that film, for sure. A movie I strongly recommend, actually, that's used a lot in, as a union, as a tool for unionizing, used as a recruitment film of sorts, right? In that way. Yeah, David, we see your comments. I'm going to get to you. I'm going to have him address all of these. It's kind of hard for me to address them and talk at the same time and whatever. But I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you. I see them. But I have another question I want to ask you, and then we can, from there, a couple questions more, and then we'll take people's comments, since there's a few of them here. There are two takes on the deportation that's chronicled in the film. One man in the film stated, and I'm quoting him specifically, that it was not an anti-immigrant move. It was not a labor busting move. It was let's make our community safe for the women and for the children, for the mines. Let's support the war effort in Europe, our sons that we sent over there, right? Then another take on it at the end commented that the deportation was a form of ethnic cleansing. How do you read those responses? Those two very different descriptions of what that deportation was and why it happened.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it forces us to, unfortunately, probably forces us to make some assumptions too about people's views. The fact that it's mentioned that they're Eastern Europeans and this is, again, we're between 1880, 1910, 1920, you have this massive migration from Eastern Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe, and with a clash of discriminatory and violence from the Northeast to the West. So under those assumptions, I'm going to say that, you know, you never talk about, or even at this point, most people weren't going to admit to the deep implicit and explicit racial biases they had. And so the history of the Southwest is one where, when it comes to Mexicans, especially, there was an ease about talking about the mongrel race and how easy it should be to deal with Mexicans in any way, shape, or form. And you know, to David's point, this to me is almost I'm going to go lean with on the assumption that, yeah, there was probably, and I think there's a comment there, and I did read some articles afterwards that stated, yeah, there was probably an undercurrent of building resentment, building xenophobic thinking, not just communistic thinking, but real xenophobic thinking that was a little bit more part of the West and the Southwest than in other places. I'm thinking, you know, the way the Chinese were thought about in California, especially as if we don't rein in the Chinese, they will take over. No one ever talked about that. It's funny. Anglos never talked about that about Mexican Americans, you know, after 1848. They never worried about a Mexican American takeover, not with the Plan de San Diego, not with any sort of plan to take this back, and not with all the different rebellious sort of movements, Juan Cortina and others who fought and killed, right? And many of the vigilante, no fear of that. But somehow, my reading is that there's a building fear as more and more migration happens in and around the Southwest of other types of ethnic groups that rub against whatever kind of racial narratives people have, because there's no explanation given as to where the worker's going to come from after you deport these people. Like, I was curious, like you cut your workforce in half. How are you going to replenish them? Like, was there any discussion about that? I mean, so to me, there's more than economics at play here, and that's why I'd say that there's definitely a little bit more of a social cultural phenomenon happening here.
Yeah. What do you think the filmmaker Robert Greene wants us as an audience to learn from this documentary? What do you think he wants us to get from this film? Because as you mentioned, and as we've discussed, there's a series of things that he touches on. And I would, listening to your assessment of it as well, I mean, there are some things in the film that, certainly right, that he could have certainly pushed a little more. I certainly like the fact that there was a way that he preferenced Fernando's story, which I thought was very, very interesting. I like you, wanted to know more about the older Mexican gentleman. The Spanish conversation, like you said, really, I found that really interesting and wanted to see more of that. But we don't get that, right? So, what is Greene's approach? And what does it mean that Greene is a white filmmaker telling this story? What does that mean? I mean, because we, as much as we would like to say it doesn't matter, I think it does matter in terms of what narrative you preference, what perspective you preference.
Yeah. I mean, to your first question, we're in an era of probably, even as we're polarized as a country, we're also talking more about our history that is leading us to continue to be polarized. And I'm not sure that's such a bad thing, because the more we learn about real history, not whitewash history, but real history, multicolored, multi-economic history, people's history, to use Howard Zinn as approach, the more we learn about that, the more we're going to push against the status quo, which is built upon a certain history. And so I think, and I'll give him all the sincere gratitude. I think he wants us to wrestle with how do each of us in our own community spaces wrestle with more knowledge about very problematic history. And we all have it. And by I mean, I'm not saying all of us as humans. I mean, there is a race, ethnic, gender specific, sexuality, identity specific, right, oppressive group, marginalized group history that has not been told. We've only scratched the surface. And what's it going to do to us as a country to come to grips with that? What's it do to Bisbee to come to grips with that? And I think that's his sincere attempt to show us, warts and all, here's a little community that had something really bad happen to it, and they're very intimately aware of it, whether they talked about it or not. I found this story. You saw when the gentleman burst in with guns. Well, they killed one guy. His name was Brewster, I believe. He was an organizer, and they just decided to kill him first. They just said, let's kill him. But the way they killed him, and I'm not sure if that was seen or not, he actually, they shot at him and he shot back at them and hurt somebody, and then they killed. And so he basically defended himself.
Right.
The consultant, the professor, she says they talked about it. There was actually, they wanted to put at the baseball field a statue of him as a hero, and the town said no. And one man got so angry, he said, we still can't talk about that. And so they put his statue in the cemetery. And so that just tells you these people know their history, and I think that he wants to show us that. Does it matter that he's white? I think so. I think it matters both in a good way, that he recognizes, and maybe Fernando, right? Fernando's the in the sea of white. Fernando's this one movement of color. There's some others, but there's very few. And you're right, he's centered. He's very centered in many of the scenes. He's in the middle. He's speaking forcefully. And so, in that sense, maybe even the documentary, maybe the director is saying, I'm learning about how this representation matters and how the lack of it matters. Because I think, as far as I can tell, he is representing what Bisbee still is. And Bisbee still is a place that you see with its struggles and its challenges and its institutions and systems. So what matters is, by being white, is just, again, you always have to ask yourself, how would a director of color maybe would have emphasized, weighted a little bit more some of the other experiences, because they were there. Mm-hmm. And we get nothing about the context of where this little town on the border sits around a time of massive violence against people of color, against Mexican Americans, mm-hmm, from South Texas all the way to California. So right at this time, 1917, 1918, 1920, we're not too far away from deporting millions of Mexicans right during the Depression. Mm-hmm. And so that's I think a missed opportunity to say Bisbee isn't just an island. Bisbee is connected to a cultural history, a violent cultural history that's happening right then and there, all around these communities, and they know about it. I read an article, the New Mexico papers, when they found out all the deportees went to Columbus, almost every paper said the same thing. Good for the Bisbee men who stood up for, even if they had to resort to illegal means, good for them. That was the narrative in New Mexico. Mm. Very few even questioned and said, well, this wasn't even about the IWW. This was just about labor speaking, about health and safety and things like that. And so, yeah, that's a missed opportunity because you don't get that from the document. This is part of a larger phenomenon. It's too centered on individuals in some ways, but you make decisions, like you said. You have to make editorial decisions, right?
Yeah, and deciding really like what kind of story you want to tell. And David, I hear you talking about the historical context and whatever, but I don't think that's the filmmaker's intent here.
Right.
I'm not saying that it wouldn't enhance the film or take away from it, whatever. But I really think that the author's intent here, or the director's intent here, is to really get the context, to get the feelings from the people who actually live in this town, and to see, with as much knowledge as they have about the events that happened there, how those events still resonate, how much of that they're repressing, and all of this, kind of in the midst of them having, as you mentioned, Sam, this tremendous pride for this town. I wonder, though, I mean, if we did add more of the historical context, I mean, I'm certain there's a way that Greene could have done that, but I think it would have made the documentary longer than, it already is, for him to kind of maybe add that context. There may have been some ways, certainly, right, that he could have maybe shaved some things out, but I really think he wanted to, like you mentioned here, Sam, community. I think he really wanted to talk about the effects of community. What does this kind of, historical weight do to a community of people, a community that has tremendous pride in where they live, and know the town's history and have been born there and raised there and whatever, and have this kind of protective nature about it. And I think that's where he was coming from with that. And I think if we put, I think if that had been too much history with it, it may have detracted from that element of it that he was trying to go for. I would think more of. Baseball equals America. I mean, there are some ways where that happened, but again, I was, again, struck by the fact that there are some people who are in that town, who love that town, and are critical of it, and critical of the way that of the way that history has been addressed and the way that went down.
Do you get a sense that, do you get a sense, what do you think about that minority voice, how it's presented?
I again, to kind of, connect to what David was saying, I think we could have gotten some of that history from that older gentleman, which I think would have been a nice balance between him and the younger generation. A Fernando, right, who's coming, again, that's why in the question I asked, this notion of coming into his own, right, having to learn. And please, I don't want you all to think, let me clarify something here. When I said I was disappointed in him, I don't want you to think that I'm that, I guess, for the lack of a better word, shallow or narrow, that I can't recognize that people grow. I do. So I don't want you to think that I'm sitting there going like, he ought to be ashamed of himself, whatever. But what I think my disappointment speaks to is less about him and more about just how ill-informed we can sometimes be about who we are in this country and the way things that happen. I think our last discussion with the Peck documentary, Exterminate the Brutes, really brings that home, just how much we sometimes don't know, because we're kind of, we've been force-fed in our academic and in spaces of scholarship. We've been kind of force-fed a particular narrative. And so that's what we've kind of gone with, until you learn otherwise. And it can be an eye-opener for you. It can be a shock for you. And sometimes you don't learn those things until you're 21 or 22 or 25, when you start reading things for yourself and you realize, hey, I've been duped all this time. And I kind of feel like that's kind of where Fernando was. Like, I've been duped all this time, kind of, because he was living in those spaces, not concerned about those things, living his life a particular way. And I think there would have been a really nice way to bridge that gap between generations if we had gotten more interaction between him and that older gentleman. I think that would have been nice to see, particularly if we're talking about community and them being, living in that space. That's how I would think.
Yeah, and I wonder, seeing those shots of the school, and there's a more than you would expect. These little tidbits about history of the school and who built the school, and the school has nice floors, and to me that might be kind of a little bit of subtext about the failure of this educational institution. When I teach a class on race, and we use Kendi's book, Stand from the Beginning, and when students read about Lincoln's personal views on race, I remember I had a student said she was angry, and she says, and it was only one page. It only took a couple of paragraphs of Lincoln's own words to realize everything I've learned about him is meaningless if I didn't know this.
Right. Yeah, Sam, I had a teacher in 7th grade tell me if it wasn't for Lincoln, my people would still be picking cotton. 7th grade. That's not that far. That hadn't been that long ago. But yeah, I can see why she was angry about that.
Yeah, and so I think you hit it right. And I think Greene wants us to come on this journey too. The more I think about it and hear you, I think sometimes you want to just go on a little psychological journey with someone, even though many of us know a lot more about what got them there, but they only know that they're there. They're only working with what they got. And you're right, Fernando's working with what he has. And I think it's a testament that he's put in the light to show when he's given, he receives and he processes, and then he grows right in front of us. It's beautiful. It's awesome. But then it reminds us how we failed generations and generations of students, all students, right? When whites don't know this history, they're also the poorer for it.
Right. Because they're being fed a false narrative too. Exactly.
Yeah. And Baldwin says, right, until whites stop hating themselves, and because the way they're taught, there's this kind of hate that just springs forth, and start hating, we won't be able to love each other. And I think that's just part of the what I hope to see, things like what we're doing right now move the needle forward.
Yeah, and I think we see in the doc also as well too, like you were talking about, that personal experience, that personal journey we get. The historical elements of these are available for us to read other places, right? It's kind of like, this doc can't give, it's kind of like what people think about the school setting. They think you're supposed to get the school setting can't give you everything, right? And the doc is like that too. It can't give us everything, but what it can do, right, is encourage us to go read more about Bisbee, to go read more about these deportations, to go down a rabbit hole of sorts and see how all of these things are connected. And then, when you go and you get that information, it enhances these more personal stories that we're getting about this town, which I think is Greene's intent, right? To tell the more kind of personal perspectives of what's happening in these spaces. And, like you say, and how that affects the community, and how the knowledge or the lack of knowledge kind of encourages, influences what, what our thinking is, and where we go from there, actually. I mean, if you watch this documentary and say, oh, well, that was interesting, and then you never look up another word, then kind of, who's that burden on, so to speak, there's so much to consider.
Yeah. I mean, and we could take a poll right now. I had never heard of Bisbee.
I had
until this documentary.
Me neither.
And so I'd heard of other things. I tend to know more about what happens in Texas, these kinds of events. But it made me connect dots and want me to learn more. Like I don't know who it was. I really want to know what happened to these men. And there's a lot of research out there, and it's a couple clicks away. So it's something for us to be able to take with us and talk to others about. When we're talking about kind of history and how it shapes how we think about ourselves.
I really made me go up and look up that house that rich dude lived in, and where they said basically he kind of ordered that. It was kind of sitting in the house like while all of it went down, and not even sure if how disconnected he was from that. And I just kind of was reading more about him, and I said, that guy was a complete piece of business, a cold piece of business, man. He was, but So, well, Sam, great. This is great. Let's take some. There's been a lot said here. Is there anything over in the comments that have been said? Albert, excuse me, not Albert, but I looked at David's last name. Sam, that you wanted to address over here before? Just that have already been said before we take specific questions.
No, I think, and David brought it up, and some others, that one of the other contexts that you do get in the film, rightly, is World War One, is kind of the tool that communism and socialism, that they were used for a very specific purpose. And again, short term, I mean, long term and even short term, not allowing unions was not a good move, right? And that's why I think unions are with us today. I think history has shown us that this was not an outside agitation. This was the worker coming into his and her own, and understanding that for capitalism to even survive, there was going to have to be some changes made to how capitalism dealt with labor. And it unfortunately was a sad struggle. It's a violent conflict, from West Virginia and all the way to California. And so I think Greene did a good point. I think multiple characters mentioned, this is a tactic. It's not a real manifestation of a political reality. This was a tactic used to push back against something that was sweeping the nation. And so laissez-faire doesn't mean that the worker can voice their opinions and their needs. It means that only the profit motive can. But as I said earlier, that's part of the problem of being in this country. You have to be a capitalist. France has French capitalists, they have French socialists, they have French Marxists, they have French libertarians, but they're all French, right? They're all, insert insult towards French people. They're all that. And they look at each other as French. There's nothing that, if you're a French Marxist and I'm a French capitalist, we're still French, right? We still know more than everyone else about wine and food and this and that. And we're proud of that. We're proud French people. Same thing goes in Germany, right? Same thing goes all over. But the United States has always had this struggle, right? Its social life is welded to its economic life, its economic modality. And so this was one of those times where that started to strain a little. It still is that way. I mean, because you're not gonna, I don't know, no one's called me a commie in a long time. But we still look askance at that person who talks about collective labor and healthy workers, and so it's still kind of in our DNA that we still struggle with. And that's why we had 2008, right? Just rampant capital greed, combined with kind of the bureaucratic, the bureaucracy that we live in, and we all have a great worldwide recession. So that was I think that was good. I was happy that was mentioned, that this wasn't even about a real infestation of any sort of communist infiltration. This was about workers who had finally said enough. So that's good.
You got to see Salt of the Earth. You got to.
I have to. Yeah. Okay. It's on the list.
It's on Kanopy. You can so we have any questions anybody want to ask about this film? If not, there's a question you have here, Sam. I want to ask you about. Is there any questions from here's one here. Message. So it says here, Michelle says, so far in the discussion, the villain of the story hasn't been mentioned. What are your thoughts about the presence and absence of the big mining companies as important characters in the story?
That's a good one. You want to take that one?
No, you can take that, Sam. You're the discussion here. I mean, I can, but I'm going to let you talk.
I talk too much.
Somebody probably
that is it
too, so that's okay.
Yeah. That's a great insight, Michelle. And I had that. The mining company looms large but small, and the one character, it was the older gentleman, right? The pro miner till he dies gentleman. he did ask a very good question towards the end there. He says, was the mining company behind it all? I don't know, but, and I'm like, I thought that was as close as we got to maybe hopefully say, of course they were, right? Of course they were, because nothing happened in that town without.
Right. That was the only industry really there. I mean,
yeah. And so I'm going to go with what Mark said, that to probably bring in more of the mining company that doesn't exist in Bisbee anymore is to probably take you a little bit away from the community that's dealing with it right here and now. I mean, the echoes of the mining company, and you got a little bit at the beginning, right? Because the comments that some people said, the mining company is going to come back someday. And Greene mentioned, has a little soliloquy that says they might, but they don't have to, because that metal is sitting there and they can get it whenever they want. And so goes capital, right? That's how capitalism works. It doesn't care about you as the worker, in the way that was framed. But yeah, I think the mining company is supposed to be kind of a stage with which this community is dancing on, literally dancing and singing on a town literally built by the mining company.
Yeah.
And so they are the backdrop. So in real sense, I like the fact that they don't become a centered character. They loom large in other ways.
I think about a movie, that in particular where the mining company is the villain is something like Barbara Koppel's Harlan County, USA,
Mm-hmm.
where you watch that and they are the villain there. And they're the villain there because, like you mentioned, Sam, they are in the moment right there fighting that battle. And that is who they're fighting against, right? Whereas in this movie, it's a different struggle. There's a different narrative here. And like you said, the mining company is what gets them to have to reconcile, right? They're responsible for what this town has to reconcile now, if that makes sense, right? They're responsible for what they're dealing with now, that past narrative, that history, if you will. They're having to kind of come to terms with that now, and the mining company did make that possible. They are responsible for that for sure. But that's another story. I think if we told a story about Bisbee, literally not in 2017, but 1917 or whatever, if we told that story, then I think we would get a much, much different narrative. And I think the mining company would absolutely be at the center of that. They would have to be. For sure. Yeah, they would have to be. That's another, the title itself, Bisbee, it says Bisbee, and it's the apostrophe 17. To let you know it could be 19 or 20.
Yeah.
Right. And the way that those things blend together. I think the title itself kind of speaks to the way this town in its current state is coming to terms with its past. And I think that is the point of that film. My question may have been misunderstood. I didn't mean to imply that the company should be centered. I meant to imply that its absence is telling.
Oh yeah.
But that's true. I think its absence in this film, I think it's aligned with what Greene is doing there, right? Mm-hmm. That he's this kind of reconciliation, if you will, with the past. And so even though we can certainly infer, right, that the mining company has a lot to do with this particular narrative, I think. If he started to tell more about that, I think it would have probably moved away from this narrative about the people of that town. But I think that absence, I think we're supposed to probably in this particular narrative infer that the mining company is the oil that greases the machine, or is the machine, I guess.
But I think, Michelle, you bring up a really insightful point, and that is, if this is more of a psychological study of a community, the mining company, they're all shackled to it psychologically. How many times do you hear the mining company mentioned in their words over and over again, not just because of 1917, but because of that town is the DNA of that town is the mining company. And so to me, I almost started thinking about how the ghost of the mining company still, enslaves these people's minds. It still has a hold on them. And, that's why this story is so hard to tell, because it does put the mining company right in the middle. It puts their families in the middle. It puts the mining company in the middle. Their whole identity as a community is right smack in the middle. But even without this, those people are still psychologically beholden to the ghost of the mining past. And the more I think about it, the more I think about how many times you're either pro or against the miners. It's almost like that's going to be the rest of your life from Bisbee moving forward after this documentary. Whose side are you on?
Speaking of, yeah. But Sam, I want to push back on you a little bit on that, because about the psychological part, because I read it as probably more sociological in some ways. Certainly more ethnographic. I think this is a form of ethnography actually here, right? Which would be actually more anthropological, so to speak. How do you? I mean, particularly if we're thinking about behavior and how people think about things, and particularly if we think about ethnography as participant observation, right? Or certainly in the realm of observation, why psychological as opposed to sociological?
No, I think you're right to say it's definitely more anthropological, right? It's a study on the culture, trying to record the culture through words and symbols. Sociology would be more if the documentary focused on groups, institutions and groups, in how they interacted with each other, right? Either from voices or from symbolic methods. So I think it is you're dead right. It is more of an ethnography in that you let the characters speak from their own personal experience, and they're not representing anyone but themselves and the culture within them, and the family connections around them, and how they struggle with that. So yeah, to me, as a sociologist, anything that's not sociology, I just call psychology, right? Because that's just, So you're right. That there's a difference. I mean, psychology would really be trying to understand how people are getting from point A to point B to point C in their thought life and the behaviors that follow from it. This is more of a reflection, right? This is more of a thinking through and processing their own lives and symbols, not I act this way because I think this way. That would have been a little bit more psychological in that sense. Whereas this is very, very symbolic. The fact of, it's a play within a play within a play. It's very ethnographic in that sense.
So you want to address David's comment? David is really pushing the historical context here, which is which I have to push back and say, I don't think this is what the film is trying to do. But David says here that as a political scientist, he finds the film a failure to really explain the historical and political narrative. It's too focused on the individuals than the historical and political significance. And I think that's what it wants to do, though.
Yeah, I don't think
it wants to.
Yeah, I mean, David and I are social scientists, right? So if we don't have meso and macro, it's like, what's the point, right? That's why I don't like psychology, But and I shouldn't say that. Psychologists are cool, even though everything they do is mostly made up anyway. But don't say it. Don't tell them I said that. This is being recorded. I shouldn't.
But that's why I mentioned ethnography, because ethnography doesn't do this. What you all are asking here, ethnography does not do.
Yep. No, you're right. You're right, and that's
particularly in performance of ethnography, which is what you're also getting a kind of performance ethnography.
Yeah, and they're we're also all teachers too, right? So I'm used to teaching and trying to bridge history with today, but from a much more macro perspective. And David, as a political scientist, right, is going to use the political institutions historically to the present. But you're right, he wants us to feel what it's like to be in this community. There's one scene that just brought it home to me, right? They're violent. Like, I'm like, these are some of the great actors. Like, I was like, they were going to hurt each other, right? When they're putting them in the trailers. Mm-hmm. And then that scene right after, where everyone's back, end scene, they're all back to themselves, and they're coming off the landing, and they're just having, but I was like, oh my goodness,
He's
right?
like, I don't think I want to get off. I don't know if I want to.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a powerful scene because it broke, but then you're like, that was too much emotion for it not to have real consequences. Like they weren't acting anymore. I think many of them were feeling what the whole point of this reenactment was. And some said that we need to feel what these people went through 100 years ago, so it can help us understand how to think about it. And in that sense, I thought that was fantastic, right? And so, yeah, to David's point, maybe I need to stay in that moment. I need to stay with that. I don't want history to come crashing in when I need to feel that connection to these people. That way, when I deal with this in my own family, I have a way to approach it, maybe.
Because I wonder if we did add more historical context, what would it do to that narrative? I mean, certainly the information would be helpful. I don't think the information would not be helpful. I think it would certainly give us context to whatever else. But I think Greene, particularly because he keeps doing it, and as I teach my students, nothing happens in film by accident. Everything that you see in a film is the director's intent. Even if it accidentally happens on the set, the director still makes the conscious choice to keep it or to take it out. So everything that's in the film, that is purposeful. It is done on purpose. So the fact that Greene is approaching the narrative this way, right, and is constructing the tale or constructing the text this way, if we added the historical component, it feels like a documentary confuses me. But I think David is doing that because I think you're looking for it to do something it's not trying to do. I think because I see what you're saying about wanting the historical context, and I can't say that it would have hurt the film. I think to have a little bit more historical weight there may have given us even more information. But I think that part is up to us.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. This was really wonderful. And I have dropped a link in the chat to our upcoming installations in this series. And I hope you check it out. I hope you join us again. And we just really, really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.